Good morning, everyone. Welcome to The Coach is In, where Kat and I are going to be showing up a little differently from our past episodes. We are going to be talking about more of our personal stories and showing up in a more vulnerable, raw, and real way. So I'm really excited to have Kat today to talk about the topic around aging parents.
Hi, Irene. Thank you so much for the intro and for kicking us off. So, as Irene mentioned, I think that we realized there's a lot of fodder just from living life that we both feel is important to address and talk about, and we're willing to kind of speak to that and kind of see where it lands. And aging parents is very much on the forefront of my mind right now. Irene's heard a little bit of this, but over the past couple of months, there's just been some instances where my own parents have had slip ups or situations come up that have felt problematic. And even like my parents in particular, there's there's a recurring, really intense memory that's been coming up for my dad. And it's as if he feels the emotions as if it happened yesterday. But it was from a situation or an event that made him upset in 1959. So that's, I'm trying to, no, 69, 1969. So that is what, 56 years ago? And so it's almost like PTSD. And it's the first time that I had to kind of force myself to look into like aging and memory and dementia and all the kind of memory and emotional things related to aging and the reality of it. And there is information out there that supports this idea that as people age and early signs of dementia, they can start to have like anger and suspicion of loved ones around them, and it may or may not be triggered by previous instances or previous life events, but their emotions and their feelings are very real in the moment. Like they can't, almost hard to reason it away. There's just some emotional ups and downs that my parents are dealing with, and a kind of a byproduct of that, given that we are a pretty close knit family. My brother and sister and I certainly consider us to be kind of close. So we feel the weight of that. You know, when our parents are unhappy, my sister is especially supportive of my mom. So she hears it and then she shares it with me and sometimes my brother. And then it becomes like this weighted blanket of negativity that impacts all of our kind of day to day on in a subtle but tangible way. Yeah, so that coupled with my brother-in-law, his mom was being scammed in August by someone that was claiming to be like friends with the celebrity group that she's a huge fan of, and they were asking her to help send money, da 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 da. And you know, it's really sad, but troublesome to think about how aging and seniors are being targeted. And so that's kind of a separate issue. And then one of my aunts passed away about 3 weeks ago. So it just feels kind of like there's been a lot on my plate lately that is reminding me of the generation that precedes me and the ways we have to care for them and you know how that might compete with our day-to-day lives and the ways we want to live our own lives and the ways we want to raise our kids. And you know, we've heard of that term, the sandwich generation, and I definitely feel like I have my seat in that on that team right now. And so yeah, it's a lot that's been bouncing around my brain. So that's kind of what I'm going to cover today. I know I laid it all out there, Irene. Is there anything, you know, before I kind of launch into kind of the first topic I wanted to let off my chest? Anything you want
Not
to
at
ask?
all. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all that. Because I know we've touched on this over the course of, our conversations in the past few months. And it's just now coming to me that thematically, this is like, the stage in life that you're at. And so thank you for what you're about to share. Because like these are very hard topics. And I'm sure I remember Ray Dalio talking about how there will come to a point in our lives in our 40s or 50s where, you're talking about the sandwich generation. You have your elders who are dependent on you and you have your kids dependent on you. So there's just a lot of responsibilities on top of, yourself, like taking care of yourself.
Mhm.
Um, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just sort of piggybacking on what you shared about Ray Dalio and his statements about the sandwich generation. I think uh, I've been reading this book called The Five Types of Wealth by Sahil Bloom that I recommend to anyone who's kind of interested in personal growth and rethinking how they want to approach their time on this planet and kind of honing in on priorities that make sense to you. In any event, he shared this personal story about how he connected with a friend of his and they hadn't seen each other in a while. And the friend was asking about, like, how many times do you see your parents? You know, how are your parents doing? How many times do you see your parents every year? How often do you see them? And the author said, I usually see them around the holidays, which resonates with me because that is the one time every year that I make sure I see my folks. Christmas has always been super important to my mom. So we all go out there for at least a week at Christmas. I bring the kids, everyone kind of descends on where my parents live. But the author was saying, yeah, they're in their mid 60s and like I see them once a year. And his friend said, okay, so you'll probably see them maybe 15 more times before they die. Just, and it's not being rude or he didn't mean to be caustic about it. It's just the math. The reality of it is if you're expected to live till about early 80s and your parents are currently in their mid to late 60s, the math of it is you're likely going to see them that many times. And for the author, it really shifted his perspective on how he wanted to define the rest of his time with his parents. And I think that that's a feeling that has really come to the forefront in my mind too. But I'm also trying to balance all of these other competing interests of like kids in school and careers. And my spouse has connections that are local or at least closer to Chicago, where I live now. So, how do you balance all of these needs and wants and pushes and pulls in a way that feels good to you? And I don't even know if there is, it feels like because there are so many different inputs, there's, there may never be an answer that feels entirely good. And, you know, that's kind of something I've been sitting with is the very likely possibility that, unlike a decision like picking a school for your kids or picking a venue for a wedding or like choosing a car, like where there's maybe fewer things, fewer boxes to check, this is kind of being part of the sandwich generation means that decisions around your parents and maybe your kids, like there's always going to be some give and take. And so the top like the highest point of satisfaction that one can get might need to be just lowered as a general rule. Like you don't, I'm kind of a, hey, I got a 90% or higher on all of these different things. Like I optimized this decision and I did all my research and I made such a good choice. Like I'm often that kind of person, whether it's picking a vacation destination or what. And so I think I'm coming to realize that this evolution of caring for parents and making decisions around living closer to them or how do we care for them as they progress in their needs may increase, there may not really be an answer that will hit all the boxes, and being comfortable with that discomfort is part of the process. Like I have to learn to accept that.
Yeah. This kind of, well, this not kind of, it actually reminds me of like when in previous episodes you were talking about like what does it mean to be a good enough parent? Now we flip the switch and say like what does it mean to be a good enough daughter? Because when you think
Mm,
about like, with your kids, it's like you have an idea of like how do you optimize them? How do you make sure that they reach their full potential, et cetera, et cetera. All of those decisions that, open the possibilities. But when you think about your parents, you shift that question of like, how do you reach your full potential to what memories do you want to create with them in the shared space and time that we have remaining?
mm. Yeah, that's actually a really good point that there are definitely parallels, to how do we define what makes us a good parent and how do we define what makes us a good daughter? And some of those exercises and points of questioning probably are similar. Like, where does, this is making me think of one of the things that I know you and I share. It's like, how does our culture, how does our upbringing, what did we see as evidence of what a good daughter is? And how does that inform what I'm feeling in the moment around how I need to show up in this space? And certainly I have gone through that exercise. And when it comes to parenting and being a mom, and I now am kind of doing it again in a different way for this, like, this space of a daughter whose parents are in a place where they may not be as physically capable or as, able to do certain things. And there's some inevitabilities and by that is a nice way, inevitabilities in my mind of saying like their time on earth here is limited. And my parents are both 82. They've already kind of both surpassed the average lifespan of an American male or female. So, there's just a lot of realities that lay ahead. And, being a child of immigrants, I definitely feel like there's an unspoken pressure to at least acknowledge, if not embrace, the ways that your previous culture, the models that existed in the previous culture, that like your from your parents' country of origin. So, my dad being Chinese, my mom being Filipino, both of them raised in the Philippines, but those are their inputs. I I feel a little guilty that I'm not living in the same city with them. I feel like they both have had family members that lived, like they both had siblings that continue to live and care for my grandparents until they passed away. And that was a safety net and that was an emotional comfort to their parents that my my aunts and uncles provided to my grandparents. My parents don't have that. And there's this, I definitely have feelings around that, There's I think that my parents understand that we are not cut from the same cloth, that we are, we're not Filipino, we're Filipino American. We're not Chinese, we're Chinese American. And that means it comes with different expectations. So I'm grateful that I know that I have some colleagues and friends that may have different experiences where kind of the country of origin expectations are much more rigid and certainly more present, and like they put a huge pressure to like send money home or support your parents as they're aging and like huge guilt trips. And I haven't really experienced that. There's subtle nudges, but there aren't outright guilt trips. There's what I get is mostly like, I wish you would move, or it would be so much better if you lived closer to us. But I don't get, why don't you move closer to us? You're being a bad daughter by not having dinner with us every Sunday. So there's, a spectrum, I think, of how immigrant children can certainly experience this. And I feel like I don't have it bad in the way of parental guilt, but I do, I'm sensitive to what it is that they would like and what it is that feels real and possible to me, and the sacrifices that would have to occur to give them what they want. And it's a struggle that I have been confronting more often than not, given their age as of late.
I
And
get the sense that, you mentioned that you are a very tight knit family, and it shows, right? Because your parents definitely want you to pursue your own lives, which is why there's not this guilt trip of like move back here, et cetera, and like it's very central to what their needs are because they're cognizant that you have your own life, you have your own family, you have your own career, and they wouldn't want to be in the way of that. But also like it's I what I find fascinating here is that your parents are also able to express what they want from you without having to without being overbearing. Because a lot of parents also I feel like they deny themselves of that opportunity to actually tell their children what they want, which buries these desires wants under the ground. And the struggle of having to find a balance between like what's for me and what's for my parents. I think it shows in your family. Like this is healthy, hard as it may seem, but this is the first time that I've actually heard a parent express something to their children, not in a way to guilt them, but like like I would like to see you more. It's nice to hear, right? As a daughter, it's like, ooh,
Yeah.
like my parents want to hear from me.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a good point. And I wonder too if some of it is informed by, so I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and had my parents, when we went to college, like I moved to Chicago for school, my brother, same thing. My sister also had moved out of state for work and school, but they opted to retire to Nevada. So I've thought about this and I wonder if they almost feel like because they moved away from where we were born, that there's maybe on some subconscious level they feel less entitled to ask and push for things because it's not like, oh, come home, like this is your home too, and you grew up here, or it would be kind of uprooting any one of us from these social fabrics that we've been entrenched in for decades solely to be closer to them. So I'm just putting it out there that I think they might put more pressure on if they live 2 hours away in the city I grew up in, because, to them that it might feel like a less heavy lift. Like, why wouldn't you want to come back here? You know it. People, you have friends here. Da, 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 da. So it's funny how inputs like that can kind of maybe influence whether or not parents feel they have leverage to kind of guilt trip people into doing things that they want, and vice versa,
Mm.
I suppose. But well, yeah, and I guess, and similarly, I my brother and I have extended. We embarked on a quick and dirty research for senior living facilities in the Chicagoland area because we both live here. And last summer, my parents had both expressed an interest in getting out of the heat of Nevada. Like, it's just so hot here, etc. So we're like, well, maybe they might relocate to the Midwest where it's much more temperate. So we, called all these senior living facilities, did all these tours in hopes that they might come to live closer to us. But it's a flip side of the same coin where they didn't they don't have friends here and
Ah.
they have no attachments to the Chicagoland area. So it's a little harder for them to imagine that. Just like I'm actually kind of having this realization again. Like I lost sight of the fact that like my reluctance to move to Nevada is similar to their reluctance to move to Chicago. Like same things. They don't have friends locally and they don't have a history in this area and they would be moving for one purpose. And yeah. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, it feels like there's not necessarily an easy solution, especially when there's decline, whether it's mental, whether it's physical, or yeah, just feeling like there's some vulnerabilities that are appearing in a more significant way, and trying to figure out the best way to support your parents can be really hard and challenging.
It also speaks to the richness of your parents' lives because because when I think about parents, like obviously I'm taking your lead on this because like I have not experienced a lot of the things that you have experienced, and so it's very nice to hear your story around this actually. And it speaks to how your parents also have their own lives, because when you think about parents, like, oh, to take care of them, why don't we just like relocate them to where we are so it's convenient for us? But
Hmm.
no, like they have their own lives too. Like it's a rich life that you can't
Hmm.
just it's not an easy decision. There's no easy answers. So I am curious, what are the things that you and your brothers, sisters, and parents have talked about or are doing to create the kind of living that would work for everyone?
Yeah. I think that the way it seems to be playing out is my siblings and I try to keep our finger kind of on the pulse or stay up to date on how they're doing. We have check-ins. My sister, I think, speaks to them almost every day. I'm not quite as communicative, but I try, we text and I try to have Zoom with my daughters and with them at least once a week or once every 2 weeks. So somewhere in there. So I think a point you raised earlier about my parents having their own lives, that is definitely something that I have way more recognition of now and a lot more compassion for. I think it's easy to kind of want to make like reduce things to like a one problem or like one question scenario, but you know, that would be if it was just one question, it kind of it would have to be almost like centered around one person's experience or another. Um, or I don't want it to be centered like that. And I think that oftentimes the default is like, and what you might see or hear about. And I think probably what my parents are trying to, like, when they have resistance, it's like, this isn't your decision to make. They still feel able-bodied, they still feel capable, they love their home, they still have friends. So recognizing that they are still in a place where those are very real things and are very important to them and still contribute in a real way to their day-to-day lives. Like that's something that we have to kind of we continually sort of monitor in a way. Like there may be like that's been their life for a couple decades now in Nevada, where they've had friends and they have neighbors that look on them, check in on them, etc. I think there will be a turning point where their world just continues to shrink. My when they first moved out there, they were driving everywhere. Both of them drove. Health issues weren't a concern at all, etc. And as they get older and things get harder, eyesight, hearing, movement, etc., they I've noticed, and I think they've noticed as well, just that things are harder, and because they're harder, they don't do them as often or they stop doing them altogether. So my siblings and I are trying to keep tabs on like when does that restriction kind of become too much? And and then at that point, my hope is that everyone will feel like it makes sense to do something more drastic. But all my brothers and my attempts to kind of get them to move closer to us or get them to move in with us, not that there's ever that's never really been on the table, but we've kind of tossed it out there that like, you know, you could do this, but those I don't think those would ever be seriously considered until that that side of the scale, like the benefits of staying are so small. The benefits of their status quo are so small that it warrants something something big, like a big change, whether it's senior living or whatnot. And that's kind of hard because I think that I was hoping to be more proactive about things. Like, in short, I have a feeling that they're probably going to stay put until something really bad happens. Either one of them passes away or there's a big accident. And I don't, because all of our attempts to try and convince them to like make moves or whatnot prior to then haven't really led anywhere. And like I said, I I kind of understand, or I can see where they're coming from. If I were in their position and I've made decisions for myself my whole life and I had a flourishing career and I was physically like always healthy, like that's got to be hard to give up. And you know, I would need some real hard evidence to show me that, like, you know, you can't do this for yourself, or maybe you don't want to do this for yourself. Like, I don't, and that's definitely the headspace that certainly my dad is in. So, yeah, I think that, like, we are all, mostly my siblings and my mom, but we're all trying to kind of just stay in touch as best we can with kind of the challenges that they have, so that we have a good sense for, like, is this a point where it feels like too much? And if so, like, how do we insert ourselves and how do we kind of push the button so that the next step feels doable to them? Yeah, kind of parallel pathing research and whatnot so that we can hopefully find options that work when they need them.
I see us both, we're looking like into the abyss, like we're really processing this. I get the sense that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I just get the sense that there's an uneasy feeling for you because like you always feel that perhaps there's danger looming around your parents, and obviously you wouldn't want harm for them, right?
Hmm.
You wouldn't want harm to come, but we also recognize the inevitability of like, yeah, you're aging, so you know, like your physical senses might not all be there, which puts you in like even larger danger. So there's this uneasy feeling because especially since you're far away, you can't really do anything immediate about it, right? And you have to be reliant on other people. That's for listening from your perspective. And I started wondering, like, what is it like from your parents' perspective? Because at this stage in their lives, what are they after? What are they looking for? What do they want to experience? And them having made the choice to like stay where they are, where they're far away from you, they must be there must be something there that they're looking forward to that enriches their lives that makes sense to stay there. So in a way, I take comfort knowing that they are getting what they want out of their lives in the moment.
Hmm.
Even though it may be hard for a daughter to like worry about them and like what could happen, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm. Yes, yeah, it's true. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's like whenever when the heart weeps for what it's lost, the soul rejoices for what it's found. I think that's a Rumi aphorism, but what you're saying is true in that regard, that, like, while I may be sad that they don't want to uproot and change their lives, I should also be happy that they are hanging on to something that still serves them, that they still find joy, and or at least, like, it's good enough that the discomfort of moving and changing is still something they don't want to deal with. Like, I'm not sure, without being in their shoes, I can't speak to every rewarding aspect of their existences, but I do think you're right. Like, there's there's a reason that they want to stay, and it's thus far that is worth sticking, staying put for and not disturbing the status quo, and that is also kind of cause for celebration in a sense. I think that and it hasn't happened for us, but a potential point of concern that I know others have had to deal with is whether the mental faculties of the parties in making that decision are truly where they should be. So, when their minds are everything, everything's there, that, and they're making this decision, that's one thing. But, you know, if there's impairment or decline, then that will be a different set of parameters that we'll have to kind of navigate with. But thus far, nothing's surfaced that's made it feel like there's a massive intervention that's necessary. Like, you hear about, I'm like hoarders, that clearly have lost sight of what's kind of healthy and best for them. And it's like, at a certain point, there might have to be an intervention from a third party against the wishes of the people. And I don't think that we're definitely not in that position with my parents, which I'm definitely grateful for. Yeah, and this is also making me think about, something that often just reminding something that often gets mixed up in this is, while their faculties are still sharp. It's important to try if you can. And I've been lucky that my mom has been a force of this for the last few years, but really try to talk about the things that need to be addressed after they're gone, you know? So certainly logistics like, do you have your affairs in order, a will or that kind of thing? But even, yeah, and like, where is the mortgage getting paid from? Like, what bank accounts do you have? Or what, if you don't even need to know all the details, but like my mom showed us a drawer. Like, here is the file drawer where I keep everything. And that's enough. Like, I don't need to know names of stuff yet, but at least having this sense for where to start if things do go south in some way feels really comforting because I know how it feels to just be in a situation where you're trying to solve for a problem and you have really little information to start with. And I know that like that's something that my mom is gifting to us is kind of input and a little bit of a breadcrumb trail. So if and when that day comes, well, it's going to come. It's just kind of how, but we do have kind of a starting point. And even beyond that, I've tried to incorporate more into our family gatherings, like at the holidays or if I travel out to visit them with the girls. I've tried to get like pull in the threads of memories. Like tell us a memory from when you were in grade school. And there are lots of board games around this, but or those table cards or conversation cards to kind of help prompt these memories. But especially because we don't live in the same city and we don't see each other that often, like I've become really aware of like them as my parents is a really like fuller picture. This is making me tear up a little bit, but than my daughter's experience of them as grandparents. And and I want to enrich that a little bit while I still have time. I just want to be able, I want my daughters to have the same sense of pride, this around who my parents are, as well as, acknowledge that they're multidimensional humans. They were not perfect. They aren't perfect. They struggled and they succeeded and sometimes they failed, but, you know, they're really rich stories that precede them. And I hope that they get a stronger sense of that.
Thank you for sharing. I'm curious, like what about these memories that you're trying to create or preserve is hard.
I don't know if it's the memories that are hard. I think it's the discrepancy between what I know, what I know of my parents, and what I think I know about what my daughters know.
Mm,
So so I think I think there's a combination of like obviously no one likes to think about death or losing someone. So there's that emotion around it, but I there's almost like this lost opportunity that I'm really aware of. I never got to know my grandparents. Excuse me. For
mm,
those of you who might be listening, I'm a bit teary-eyed at the moment. So I think that like kind of that. I think that's what's emotional about it is both of my dad's parents died when my grandma died before I was born, and my grandfather on my dad's side died when I was like 1 year old, maybe 2 years old. And then my mom's parents lived longer, but they were always in the Philippines. And there was no internet, there was no texting at the time. So our communications were pretty much limited to letters on occasion and then like a visit every few years, longer spans of time as we got into activities and things like that, and phone calls on the holidays. And I didn't really I didn't think I was missing anything. And I still, this is every family is different, so I'm not holding I don't feel like I'm comparing my experience to like some mythical gold standard in Hollywood of what a grandparent grandchild relationship could be. But I think I'm as my like seeing my mom's grief when my grandparents died and then hearing stories about them from her after they died has made me kind of as I've because they died when I was, in my 15s and 20s. So I've had a lot of time to kind of hear stories about my mom's upbringing and who my parents were. But it's there's almost like a sadness around like that I wasn't able to know them. And I don't want that for my daughters, especially it may not be possible for them to appreciate my parents just given that they're teens and given that they're naturally wired to be kind of selfish. But I know my mom and I know my dad and I know there's some of their stories and like to me they're pretty awesome, you know? And I think that sorry, I don't know why I'm crying. I actually know why I'm crying. Actually, I'm totally starting my period today. So I'm a little extra emotional. This morning I was
Oh,
like, oh, something's coming.
but like these are still real emotions, and the state of being is amplifies it, but these are still real emotions and real life challenges. So what I'm hearing is basically you have a desire to preserve not just like stories told, but you want your daughters to experience your parents for the wonderful people that they are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like it's not about collecting a book of stories that, while that might be nice and helpful, it's less about that. And I think you're right that it's more about like there there are people that don't get this opportunity. And like just I would love to help them make the most of it while they still can. Pause, dramatic pause while I wipe my tears.
Yeah, because
Um,
I don't know what to say because when we desire something and we there's no way to fulfill that desire, it's really hard, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. And I also recognize that a lot of it is out of my control. And I think that we all inherently know how that feels. Like I was reading or some article about worrying and how, you know, there's so many thoughts on why it's kind of pointless, right? Like we invest this emotional energy on thinking through all the possible outcomes of something that may not happen, and it takes away, it steals energy from the present. And so, I think about that. I also think about like from a religious perspective. I remember hearing someone say at some point that when you worry, you show a distrust in God. Like that there's almost like a spiritual release aspect to faith that requires that like you don't worry. Like if you're a truly faithful believer, that everything is going to work out as it should, whether you're like when you believe in God or the universe or whatever, then worrying is pointless. Like
Mm.
it might not mean the best outcome, or you're like you may not get the expected outcome, but you have faith that this is meant to be and that there's a reason for this happening. So, I when I think about these emotional ups and downs around things that I can't control, like I can't control how much my girls are going to like the idea of spending time with my parents, or which they love spending time with them. It's just, you know, they don't always, they're not like on speed dial. They're not calling my grandparents to say, "Oh, my math test went great." And that's okay. Like it's not something that is for me to worry about. And I think that's a huge part of maybe all of this too is, in this space of having so many competing needs and worrying about your parents, there isn't like we have to recognize that there's only so much that we can do, and there's only and investing emotional energy in trying to kind of get ahead of things or work through everything may not be the best use of one's time. I know I'm definitely a planner, so there are times when it like it might feel stressful in the moment, but recognizing like, oh, there's three senior living options that aren't too far from them that are within this price range. Like that puts my mind at ease, and then I can shuffle it away in a filing cabinet in my brain somewhere and I feel good. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but I think, the unnecessary angst or rumination and lengthy things about things that could happen, like my dad could get worse mentally, my mom or dad's physical health could continue to decline at an accelerated rate, but I don't know that. And worrying about that when there's like no way to know it's going to happen, I think I'm learning is not helpful. And so being able to acknowledge that and kind of bless and release, as they say, I think is something that when you're in the sandwich generation, you start getting more and more used to, ideally, for your own sanity.
Yeah. You bring up really good points because, what do you do with that worried energy? Like you act on it, right? Because like if you act on it, then somehow you can be as prepared as you can get. Like there's no way of telling what will come. There's no way of preparing for that. And so once you've done all you can within your capabilities and with the time you have for it, the word that comes to mind as you were sharing earlier is foreboding joy. Because, as we spend the present time worrying, then we're sort of taking away from the possibility of just enjoying the present. Because, like you said, like it may or may not come. And like in the case of like aging parents, there's this inevitability of something happening, but it doesn't mean that as we're waiting for that to happen, that we should feed into the worry of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's a good reminder to that there is something that kind of like earlier when we were talking about flip sides of the same coin, and that when we invest in one thing and we generate worry, we're kind of taking away from something else, which very likely is you being present, you feeling calm, and you showing up in other spaces in more in the way that you want to. Like I certainly know that there were moments when my concern for my parents or my mom kind of infiltrated the times that I was spending with my family. And to a degree, it's inevitable. Like when you're sad, you're sad. But at the same time, adding worry to that would have made it like taken away time that I want to spend with my kids and my partner. And that's not what I want, right? Like, let's think big picture. Let's look at this from a holistic perspective. Like, there are other ways that I want to use my time, and like a quality to the time that I want to have with people. And if If that is what gets me out of that space of worry, then, you know, use that as a reminder for sure.
Mm. Wow, this episode brings a lot of emotions. And like I say, hard as they may be, I think it's actually very, what's the word here? Surreal? Because I start imagining, or like I read articles of like people and their loved ones' final moments, and how do you want to experience that? Because in a lot of cases, oh, we see people in hospitals and like trying to
Mm-hmm.
resuscitate them, but like that is not the experience. Is that the experience that you would want your loved ones to have? I don't think that the people who remain want that. So like the way that they would like to experience it is like to just be present for their loved ones, and in that way it
Mm,
becomes more meaningful and lighter, and there's more of a connection there. Like you want to savor those connection.
yeah. Yeah. And those, this is just coming up, I guess, as maybe a parting thought, but those connections aren't necessarily judged by the quantity, but by the quality, right? So just because, like in my situation, I may not see my parents every day doesn't mean that we don't have an incredibly strong bond. But connecting with them in the time that we have and making sure that they know how I feel is kind of that will be the most important takeaway, I think, versus like, did I live next door to them? Did I see them every day? I don't think that's a metric that anyone, or it certainly it doesn't work for my and my parents' lives. So I guess, I'm going to be reminding myself of that as well as I go through these emotional ups and downs and I grapple with guilt on occasion. But hopefully, the listeners too, right, remember that connection is key and it's not something that's based on how long you spend with someone necessarily, but more about, yeah, the depth of the time you're with them.
I love that. Thank you for sharing, because I'm sure that there are a lot of families out there who don't see or have a model for what healthy families could look like, and I see that in yours. So it's
Mm.
kind of like a model to look up to and follow. So thank you for sharing and being vulnerable today.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for holding space for me, Irene. And I will give updates as things progress, but I really appreciate being able to share this with you.
Thank you. And thank you for the listeners for staying this far. We'll see you again next time.